Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar in the telemedicine series. In this first webinar, we will be touching on the notion of efficiency. This webinar series is presented by Baxter with the participation of Università Cattolica in Italy. And without further ado, I'll pass it to, hi, I'm Denis Gagné from Triage. And my co-presenter here is Dr. John Zverberly, and I'll pass it to John for the introduction of this presentation.
Okay, so the talk today is on process automation and telemedicine. And one question people have is, what is telemedicine, telehealth? And basically, it's delivery of health care at a distance using telecommunications. It is not really a single concept, but actually covers quite a diversity, both in topics and in the technologies that are used. It's also something that is possibly standalone, but it's far more useful when it's integrated into the rest of patients' overall care. Next slide, please. Yeah, when we look at telehealth, this has a long history, and as technology's evolved, it's expanded. Telemedicine goes all the way back to probably before the telephone, but quickly expanded into emails, bidirectional video, device interfaces, and now we're getting into robotic control with more and more technology expanding the scope of what can be done. Next slide, please. When we look at the benefits and disadvantages of telemedicine, there's a variety of things you can say for and against it. On the one hand, the benefits include that it's convenient for people who might be homebound or have difficulty traveling. It's definitely safer in a pandemic. It's more efficient both in patient and provider time and resources. It may give access to support and care that may not be otherwise available. And then it can also help close blind spots that exist in healthcare when the patient and provider aren't with each other. Some of the disadvantages is that it's definitely dependent upon the quality of the communication, and so if a rural area has poor internet connectivity, the telemedicine support is poor. There can be disparities between those who have good technology and those who don't. It can be difficult to establish rapport between the provider and the patient. There can be problems with confidentiality, and then certain subtleties in care can be missed. Next slide, please. When we look at telemedicine, the COVID-19 was definitely a boost to the whole area as people used it for both routine care and for acute care. As COVID-19 slowed down over the spring, there was a decline in its use as more offices opened. But the future is that it probably will continue to expand. Many large providers and technology companies are investigating it, often using it in very creative ways. Next slide, please. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, John. I'd like to now provide a little bit of an introduction to business process automation and how it can be applied in the context of telemedicine. So before going too deep into the topics, we're looking at marrying two sets of open standards that exist, one set from the Object Management Group and one set from HL7 International. So on the Object Management Group, we have BPMN, CMMN, and DMN. I'll explain a little bit what they are after. From HL7, we'll look at using FHIR and CDS Hook. So there's a new community of practice that was created called the BPM Plus Health Community of Practice. You can find the URL at the bottom of the page here. And this community of practice is really looking at how we can create and exchange shareable pathways and clinical pathways and automatable clinical guidelines in a way that is meaningful, so that we actually can exchange some shared knowledge packages. To do so, we're relying on a series of open standards. And one set of open standard that is of interest to us here is everything that has to do with workflow automation, which is this notion of orchestrating activities in order to react to event. And also another set of technology, which are decision automation, which is technology that gives us capability of doing automated decision. And to do so, we rely on three standards, DMN, which is the decision model and notation, which provides us decision table and logical expression, BPMN, which is the business process model and notation, which is a way to provide a prescriptive sequence of activities, and CMMN, the case management model and notation, which is a declarative, unstructured way of capturing event condition actions context. And with this workflow automation and decision automation, we can both have human in the loop or not. So this automation can be what we call straight through or unattended, or can be with a user involved, mostly knowledge worker, in the case of healthcare, probably more providers, and then we have an attended type of situation. So to give you a little bit of a look at what this is a BPMN diagram, and it's basically just a sequence of activity that are drawn visually, and that says the sequence of activity that must take place. Here I have an activity followed by another one, followed by another one. Here I have the table means a decision, and then at this break point here, which is this gateway, I can go either way. This is an exclusive choice, and then we can visually capture the logic of how things should get done, and also how the decision should be made. And this is a very visual way that is very amicable to the subject matter expert to capture their knowledge, but is also machine automatable. So a machine can actually take those models, these diagrams, and execute them. So what are the benefits of using such kind of open standards and technology? Well, it provides us with a visual story of the patient's progress. We can actually visually see the patient's progress, which will give us better coordination of patient care. It also provides us a standardized clinical pathway, which gives us a rapid access to evidence-based. As we know, access to evidence-based knowledge in healthcare tend to be delayed. I've heard numbers saying up to 17 years before these best practices are put in practice. This gives us faster access to these. Provides us data in context so that we can have better decision at the point of care. So when we go to do an actual act, we can have data provided that is the contextual data needed at that time. And it also improves our organizational and operational efficiency by providing better clinical and also financial outcomes, because we can also manage the efficiency of the care delivery. So both focusing on value delivered care and also on the elements that affect the financial aspect of this. So I'll send it back to my colleague, John, to talk to you about a particular example that we want to discuss here today.
Okay, our topic for today is to discuss nurses who provide teletriage of an ill-appearing infant. And this is probably historically one of the most widely used areas of telemedicine that people are familiar with. Next slide, please. Yeah, nurse triage basically consists of a relatively simple setup, at least it was historically, where all you needed was to hire some nurses, develop some protocols, get a phone bank, and you could be pretty much up and running to field questions from patients that might come in. The most common use for fielding questions was in pediatrics, especially during after-hour care. To make nurse telemedicine work, you needed to hire some nurses, you needed telephone access, you needed to schedule enough nurses so that there were some there at all times. You need to have the nurses perform a variety of duties. There were challenges that needed to be met by having not too many nurses around so they were idle, nor not enough nurses so that wait times were a problem. And this is primarily a problem when there's pandemics or outbreaks. And finally, most of the decisions are made by nurses who very carefully follow protocols that have been established to reduce liability and to optimize care. Next slide, please. And so when one looks at the whole process of teletriage, one needs to ask some questions. Is it, as it originally was set up, is it necessary that nurses perform all the duties? Is it possible that some of the tasks that they do can be offloaded to non-nurse people, such as a clerk, or are there automated bots that can be done to perform certain duties? Can introduction of technology reduce the number of nurses or increase the efficiency of how they spend their time? Can you use remote monitoring of patients' vital signs to get more accurate data? Because it's it's relatively common that when patients collect vital signs, there may be errors in how they've done it. Can you rapidly get access to the knowledge about the patient from the medical record, which may not all be just in the local practice, but might need to be collected from multiple routes? And then can the exchange start with the patient talking to a data collector prior to actually talking to the nurse, where the nurse's role is more to oversee the data and then quickly make triage decisions at that point. Next slide, please. And so the core of any of these triage systems is to have effective protocols. These have been around for some time. They're readily available over the internet. And basically, they're a series of protocols that are set up to meet various clinical situations. If a problem comes in, the person who's responding finds the appropriate protocol, looks it up, and then follows either a flow diagram or uses tables to reach a decision. And this is one that can be used for an ill-appearing infant between 1 and 12 months of age. And basically, you have a table where you have findings along the left column. And what you do is take the findings that you see and then decide, is this critical, acute, urgent, or non-urgent? If a patient has any critical values, so it's any, it labels the patient as critical. If all of the non-urgent conditions are present, then the person is non-urgent. And then you have kind of a mixed milieu in between where the person could be acute or urgent, depending upon the mix. One question that comes up with this type of approach, where it's not really a score, it's basically a summation of different categories, is when does 2 of a lower level equate to a higher level, so that do 2 or 3 acute equal 1 critical. So there's a type of decisions that need to be handled by the system. One area that's a problem for the infants is vital signs, because vital signs change with age, especially during infancy. And so it's very important to have accurate knowledge of what these vital signs are, and then the age of the patient, so you can characterize the patient effectively. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the methodology that's present, we have a narrative, and that's basically the protocol. Then the first task is to come up with an independent model that really isn't computerized. Basically, it's a diagram. And what this does is it tries to capture the behavior in the narrative in a visual way. Once you've got that done, you need to go to the next step, which is to make a platform independent model where you go through and add executive logic to the model so that it can actually function as expected. And then finally, there's target integration, where you actually tie the data sources, the computer, and the model together to something that really executes. And each of these steps has connectors indicated in red, which basically glue the two together. And so between the narrative and the computational model, there needs to be a connector then the various technologies are there to help enable it. And at the end, FHIR is available to make the data interoperable. Next slide, please. So when we take the model that we previously showed and diagram it in BPM Plus type modeling notations, this is an example of what you basically see, where on the left you have a small circle which indicates the entry point, and the trigger is an ill-appearing infant. You go then to a data collection stage where the caller provides the information as outlined in the protocol. Once the data is available, then this is summated in a DMN model, which basically classifies the patient as critical, urgent, acute, or non-urgent. One thing you'll notice in the diagram in the left lower corner is a small icon, and that indicates that this is an attended task. This is the point where the nurse can come in and either adjust the data based upon information she's had with the family, or she can modify the status based upon what data she's seeing. Therefore, the nurse really can moderate how the behavior happens. After the triage status is done, the status then decides through a gateway which path is followed. So the critical patient requires urgent care, and so often this requires dispatch of an ambulance to bring the child to the hospital. An acute would be one where the family is instructed to bring the patient to the emergency department. For an urgent one, this could trigger either a call with a higher level nurse or with the pediatrician. And if it's non-urgent, then you would probably route the patient to a scheduling app that could schedule a visit at the next day at the doctor's office. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the various steps in doing it, up till now, what you saw was something that is basically, one would assume, is just a visual representation. But the visual representation sits on top of powerful tools that actually are executable by the computer. And so one of the glues that holds things together is the tying things together, and this illustrates how this happens, where the triage status gives a number of possible choices, and then on the right, at the gateway, the various status is used to decide which branch is followed. So this is the logic that is followed by the computer for it. And I believe that brings us to the demo. Back to you, Denny.
Thank you, John. So let's jump into a bit of a demo, if you may. So here is the within the tool, the model that John was explaining. So you can see that this visual representation gives us the sense of what needs to happen when, and a little bit of how through the logic. And John mentioned, and we're going to focus in the demo here, I just want to focus mostly on the fact that we can turn these activities into attended or unattended activities. So for example, if I take this model here and I go into the execution, I can actually publish this drawing and its information within the model and create a service out of it. And when I create a service out of it, it provides me an API to that service. So go dig it out. So if I run this service now, and here we're focusing mostly on the logic and not on the interface. The interface, you can put any wrapper interface in front of this. It could be a chat bot, could be a web page, could be an application. So here the important is we want to show you how the logic is enabled to follow the workflow. So if I run this, the first thing that I have is to get the answer from the caller or the parent about the information. I'll just enter some data here. just to trigger thing, I won't go through all the details. Then when this is sent in, then right away, this takes us to the dispatch ambulance because this case was considered, and I could, if I click here, I can actually do the call. I won't do that call to dispatch the ambulance. And that's because the triage was being critical and the end was to provide critical care. So basically what happened is we took the information, we made the decision that this was critical and went directly to recommend the triage, the dispatch of the ambulance. Now, what's very nice about this kind of approach is that I can come here and take this particular decision here and make it an attended task. And if I make it an attended task, I can choose to verify the inputs and the outputs. So I can say, please confirm these inputs, and then confirm this decision. And then if I just republish this model, I'll put it on version 2 here, and I publish this model. So now I have another version of this service where if I run it, it starts the same way. It asks for the caller's inputs. I'll enter the same just for the sake of showing the same behavior logic. As I do that now, but instead of giving me the actual decision, and you can see even my typo there of please confirm this input, and then it shows to the nurse or the provider all the inputs that were provided, and he can say, yes, that's correct, or no, glucose, that was a bad, an old data, I now have a new value of 90, and actually run the decision. And then because I did that, the attention was put also on the conclusion, it asked me to confirm this decision. And here the system is telling me that it is a critical situation. But let's say for whatever reason, or mostly for the sake of my demo, the provider decide that this should be non-urgent. I'm ignoring what the system said to me. Then it takes me to a schedule visit with the provider, and I have a link to go to the calendar, and that takes me to the calendar there. So in this situation, what we've done is we had the same kind of data. The nurse overwritten one of the values, and then when the decision was made that this was really critical, the nurse or the provider decided, no, this was non-urgent, and it went into scheduling an office visit for that particular infant or case. So that's giving us a lot of flexibility on how this are carried out. All this logic is carried out within a case. So I'll pass it back to John now for some comment and conclusion.
Okay, the goal of the webinar was to talk about improving efficiency. And really, when one looks at the whole process of giving teletriage, it really is a series of tasks. And the tasks are lifted to the left. In the middle, we have historically how it's done. And then on the right, we have how can you do things in a better or more automated way. For example, the second one, the task is to get data on the current vital signs. Before, the nurse, whoever was the interviewer, would try and jot down values, which may or may not be reliable. Now we've got the ability to have device monitoring, so you can have real-time data analysis. It also gives you the ability to take all the data that's been collected and then shoot it off to a dashboard so that who's ever reviewing the data remotely can get a more accurate idea of what's happening rather than a single snapshot. And so as you go down the list, there's a whole variety of ways that things can be done. Now, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And I think the point that Denny made of having attended tasks is very powerful, because from regulatory and liability and patient acceptance views, having something where you're dealing with a person who is experienced and able to respond to the clinical situation is very valuable. So because you could automate the system entirely, prudence would dictate that what you want to do is optimize how it's done. So in conclusion, we've introduced some topics about telemedicine. The key is for improving efficiency is to have well-structured protocols. Once you've got the protocols, then you can develop the models, which is the basis for the automation. We've talked about BPM Health and the standards that they promote. We've talked about the methodology of going from the protocol to an executable model. It's important to realize that the diagrams are far more than just a diagram. They're both a diagram that people can use, but also executable code that is can be run by computer. And then we've discussed how can you improve efficiency using these models. Now, this is the first of a series of webinars on telemedicine. The second one will be on improving patient safety and patient care. A third will discuss how do you reduce liability, and the final one will be done with our partners at Baxter and Cattolica University in Rome to discuss the perspective as seen by Italians, especially during the recent COVID-19 epidemic. Back to you, Denny.
Thank you, John. So we're at the end of our presentation. We'd like to open the floor to questions, although we're running out of times a little bit. So we invite you to enter your question if you have any on the panel on the right that you should find on the right for any questions. And if we don't have time to address your question during this session, we'll do our best to try to reply via emails to you. We thank you very much for your attendance. We hope this series on telemedicine will be very useful to you. We made those short 30-minute type of interventions so that it's easy to consume and look at. And please feel free to reach out to either Dr. Zwiberly or myself. You have our emails at the top here should you need anything. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll see you at the next telemedicine webinar.
And again, thank you very much.